Less than 24 hours from now, Congressman Paul Ryan is expected to unveil the Republican budget plan for 2012. It is expected to include $4 trillion in spending cuts over the next 10 years. Our next guest says the time has come for such a game-changing budget strategy. John Taylor is an economics professor at Stanford University and a former undersecretary for the U.S. Treasury. He's also the co-author of an op-ed in today's Wall Street Journal with Nobel Economics laureate Gary Becker and former Secretary of Treasury, among many other things, George Shultz, about how less government spending could boost growth and employment. And first of all, John, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. Let me ask you about this one statistic, because I know this is one thing that Carol zeroed in on this morning. Is it the case that when you see less government spending, you do always see the private sector come in with more spending of its own, with more hiring of its own?
Not all the time, but that's a rule that you see quite a bit. It's a regularity, and I think in particular, if you look over the last 20 years, you've seen government purchases to go in the other direction. We've had a lot of increase in purchases recently, and unemployment has gone up. So the real thing here is to focus on the private sector. That's where the jobs are going to come from, and I think the government can help that by removing the uncertainty of this debt and this deficit, the possibility of tax increases, so that you can get the private sector firms out there hiring people, and that's the surest way to reduce unemployment.
I believe we have a chart here with private investment and jobs. There you see it. We have in white there investment as a percentage of GDP, and in yellow the unemployment rate. So you can see that when investment as a percentage of GDP comes down, we have unemployment rising. Now, I'm assuming that this investment here is actually government spending as a percentage of GDP on the chart. I don't want to confuse anybody at home.
No, it's just the opposite. And that's the point, though. I'm glad you pointed that out. The investment is the private sector investment. So if you look at a chart like that, when private investment rises, there is business investment or housing, that creates jobs, and so the unemployment rate falls. So private sector investment goes up, unemployment goes down, and vice versa. Now we've had this very sharp drop in investment, and unemployment is high. So what we really want to have happen is to reduce that unemployment rate, which is still very high. And a big part of that is getting firms to hire, giving them the incentives, so investment begins to rise. And I believe this effort to address our serious fiscal problems removes a lot of the uncertainty and concerns businesses have about the future, and will be a positive stimulus to employment.
And John, that's a big part of it. I mean, what you write in this op-ed, I mean, we need to understand the government's strategy at this point when it comes to tax policy. Corporations need to kind of know what's coming down the road. They also need to know what the government's going to do about the deficit and so on. So that's really kind of one of your main points. We need to understand what's going to happen, not just over the next 6 to 12 months, but really over the next couple of decades.
Absolutely. The idea we stress in this piece is the policy should be as credible as possible and thought of as a strategy. You start now in 2011. I think that some of the things that they're trying to do in the Congress now to reduce spending in 2011, bring it back to 2008 is a good start. But then, as you say, you want to outline a strategy to get spending as a share of GDP down, you get the growth rate up. And I think people can understand that. It's not draconian. It's really the kind of thing that we need to have, and it will be reassuring to people to know that the government can actually take on this important task.
Can we really afford to make these cuts at this point? I mean, I too am troubled, very troubled by the deficit that we have in Washington. But is the economy in strong enough standing, and are you so sure that private investment money is going to come in, do a lot of hiring, do a lot of investing if the government cuts back substantially? Or could significant government cutbacks start to cripple us on an economic basis?
Well, the thing I think you have to realize is that the cuts that are being proposed are really not cuts relative to just 2008. In other words, we've had a big spending binge in the last couple of years. You can see that in the chart in our Wall Street Journal piece. And so all this is doing is trying to first bring spending back, plus a little bit for inflation, to where it was in 2008. So that shouldn't be so hard. And then, of course, you got to look at the next 10 years. And if you do this gradually, so it's clear to people, entitlement reform doesn't affect people who are over the age of 55, for example, then there's time to adjust.
You're watching Street Smart. We're back with economist John Taylor. John, let me ask you, what you say in your op-ed today is that government spending, what a lot of people say is that government spending sort of crowds out private investment. But what is to make you believe that if you reduce that government spending, that the private investment would come back in here? Because that's really the issue, right? That's why the government started spending in the first place, because of the lack of private spending.
That's right, and I think you can see in these charts that increase in government spending didn't do what people hoped it would do. It didn't increase investment. It didn't increase jobs. You can't see much effect at all. So what we see as the problem in this piece with George Shultz and Gary Becker is that the uncertainty created by these really gigantic deficits, 10% of GDP, and rapidly increasing debt, the concerns of that may imply higher taxes, may imply higher inflation, may imply even a fiscal crisis. All those things are bad for economic growth and bad for the economy, and we've got to remove those impediments, if you like. And I think the strategy, like we outlined in our piece, does that.
John, we just showed a chart showing government spending as a percentage of GDP and what happens with the unemployment rate to kind of show, as we see more government spending, we see the unemployment rate go up. What I want to ask you, though, and I've got a viewer writing in, Trey writing in, he says there's nothing keeping private investment from the economy other than a lack of demand. I think he brings up a really good point that if there was a ton of demand out there, corporate America would, I think, be very eager about investing and doing a lot more hiring than it currently is. So isn't that kind of a key point that's kind of holding it, putting aside the government?
Absolutely, that's a good point. Firms need to sell their products. They want to have some certainty that people will spend in the future. So when they look ahead and they say, oh, geez, taxes might go up, that's going to discourage spending. Or there's going to be a pickup of inflation, that's going to discourage spending. Or if people will be concerned about another crisis, that's going to discourage spending. So if you remove those uncertainties, firms will say, hey, this looks like a better economy than we thought. And they'll begin to look forward and begin to hire and invest. So it's not anything inconsistent with this view and the view that demand is important.
I wonder what you think of, government spending here. We've talked about, or some people have talked about, actually capping it as a percentage of GDP with an amendment to the Constitution. Do you think that Congress needs to go that far? Because otherwise, politicians in Washington simply cannot help themselves. You've already got people falling short of election campaign promises from the midterms. And as far as spending, everybody wants to get as much spending for his own state as he possibly can. Do you need to cap that legislatively?
I think the first thing to do is to look at the House budget resolution and what they plan to do. And if they have specific instructions to the subcommittees, which can be enacted into law, I think that's a tremendous improvement and accomplishment along the lines of bringing spending down to really no more than what it was in 2007 as a share of GDP. It shouldn't be that hard. Now, then I think the idea is kind of locking in spending restraint does make a lot of sense, and it could be done legislatively. But the first things first, do 2011, show that it's possible for government to do something, and then work on 2012 and the next 10 years, and then consider these other reforms that you're referring to.
All right. Hey, John, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. John Taylor coming to us there from Stanford.